Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm going to walk you through the Australia's new ESG mandate. Specifically, its focus really is on the emissions side. Here's my agenda. I'll cover who's impacted by the 2025 mandate and the timeline in terms of how it's being slotted out. So here's a bit of my bio right now. I'm a CPA CGA. I've been working on the sustainability area for over 20 years. It's become more prevalent over the last 3 to 4 years with more demands for disclosure around environment, social governance, with the key focus being the emission side. I always like to have a discussion specifically what countries or where they're at. In the case of Australia, this is based on 2022, but most of the large organizations, whether that's BHP, Coles and other organizations in Australia, they've already have pre-established sustainability departments because of where they are in terms of the voluntary reporting. And as you can see, there's 263 companies. They've all put together, in those cases, voluntary reporting. So it's not new that on any of this reporting around the emissions because they've been doing it for a while. The other key thing is I always like to break down emissions into key points. The emission side, ESG into the emission side, the social and HR governance, the corporate governance, the waste management, including the circular side, the facility side, and that's the overall maintaining those facilities, biodiversity, that gets into habitat, wildlife, vegetation, indigenous, and even in the water cycle in the oceans. And then, of course, water management in terms of what we do with that, because water is such a precious resource. So when we talk about Australia in general, this gives you a good example of the GDP makeup. Uh, Australia's economy typically is driven by a lot of it is if you look at near um, by mining and natural resources area. That's the key area, and that's where you see they're exporting a lot of iron ore, and it's critical, and they're a big player in the lithium area. This gives you an idea a bit about the makeup in terms of the economy, in terms of a lot of it small, medium-sized companies. The large players play a big role as well. You can't talk about Australia unless you talk about their grid. A bulk of their grids, and this is the Scope 2 emissions, comes from coal fire. Now, there's a big plan to transition off coal, and that could include nuclear, natural gas. Natural gas is becoming a key focus point because it has less in terms of the emission side, but it's still an emission player, but it's still part of the overall grid footprint. This gives you an idea where Australia plays in terms of its emissions. They're close to 60 some odd percent of their power is from fossil fuels. Now, if we look at reporting entities, and this is evolving as we speak, they just passed the law. The large corporations will be mandated starting in 2025 to report in, and in most cases they're already capturing the emissions. They just need to do the certification now and following the reporting templates as part of the overall emission requirements. But as you can see, as the medium-sized companies, they're following 2 years later, and then the smaller ones in 2028. So by 2029, bulk of all public and private sector enterprises will have to report their emissions in. Now, there's some confusion around the public sector side, and I think that's evolving as we speak because they do have their own footprint in, whether that's the military, whether it's hospitals, with their facilities, there's an environmental footprint there. So this is basically what it's talking about, global warming, climate change, and the focus being on the emission side. Now, here's the key thing here. As you can see, the exempt are charitable organization, not for profit. Now, that's going to be something I think will become a moving target because I think there'll be some pushback from the private ones, ones that aren't listed and ones that are listed on the stock market. But I think it'll evolve over time in terms of everybody will have to requirement. Because if you think of it with the Scope 3 emission requirement, that involves the supply chain. So if the government is procuring stuff, they'll have to be looking at part of the overall Scope 3 supply chain. This just gives you a little bit more example in terms of the requirements report from the sustainability report, the climate change report. So basically, they're going to have to swear off. The good news is anybody in internal audit, And external audit, this is just going to add to your compliance cycle, and it's also going to add into, maybe it's time to review your GRC footprint and solution as part of the overall sustainability reporting. This gives you the thresholds, if you look here, group 1, group 2, group 3, and how they're going to be transitioned in. So I always like to talk about scope 1, scope 2 just as a refresher. Scope 1 is your direct control. Scope 2 is when you're starting to get indirect control of emission. That's your power generation. Scope 3 is your complete supply chain from start to finish. This gives you an idea, a little bit more around the breakout in terms of the revenue and asset base it's based on and the thresholds. Now this gives you a chart here where it's basically showing you the 2025 to 2026 and where they're talking in the phase-in approach. This gives you an idea where the fiscal year cycle, when the reporting cycles coincide, and when you're expected to report as part of the overall regulatory cycle for this emission, the emission reporting requirement from the Australian government. This gives you an idea of the methods, method 1, method 2, in terms of the reporting, because this is where you're starting to get into breaking down the pieces of how emissions are produced from power generation to the production cycle to finished goods being produced in. Method 3 is listed here, and then method 4. Now, carbon accounting is one area that is coming under a lot of focus, and the reason I say that is there's a lot of concerns around the calculations, and I think over time there needs to be a standard around the rules, right? Just like we have for when you can do absorption costing or variable costing, we establish rules around the costing model. I suspect down the road over time that we will come up to a more clear model for this. Now, what this really does right now, on an annual basis, they're doing a lot of the work. I can see now with these mandates now being pushed that they'll become part of the operational and management reporting cycle, because it's easier to work on them and target than versus all this, and then you can keep the metrics, because you may be asked on a quarterly basis now with these mandates by the investor community, whether it's the banking, whether it's the pension funds, or your individual investors, is also becoming a role where the activist shareholders will want to get more insight around your ESG footprint, and particularly this mandate around emissions. I put a little bit about the approach. There's the spend approach. It gives you an idea how you can calculate based on particular how you're buying goods in, and you're calculating your emissions based on your ordering cycle. The activity base is a little bit more complicated. It just gives you a little bit more how you're tracking it through. This is why modeling is going to become critical. You're going to have to look beyond Microsoft Excel to kind of do these calculations and look at business analytical tools that you have or need to purchase, or maybe you already have existing BA tools that you can leverage as part of doing this carbon accounting. This gives you an idea of the comparison of the methods. And I think once you, like anything else, once you establish a method, you pretty well have to stay that method. Unless you have underlying logic why you're changing it, I think you need to be clear about this in terms of your methods. I've always emphasized anytime you're dealing with an ESG blueprint, that ESG, you should have a blueprint. And it's like an internal control blueprint, so you're mapping the objective. So if we're, like I talked earlier about the emissions, you're mapping the emission objective all the way through in terms of the data and the metrics to the reporting cycle in terms of the frequency. And that would be the same thing with your HR policies. They're mapped all the way through. What are the challenges? These challenges aren't any different than any other country. Data management, because you're dealing with where that data is being captured from your plants, your mines, your facilities, whether that's the electricity, whether it's other things, you need to be able to pull that in. So that might be result in you doing a data modernization to where you're looking at a data lake. It may look at how you stage it into like a data mart to do it, because most companies are concerned with leaving ports and IPs open to possible data theft or cybersecurity attacks. So it's going to come how you want to stage the data. Because of the complexity that we're doing with some of these calculations, the criticality here is looking at how you leverage data and AI through carbon accounting modeling. And there's solutions like OneStream, IBM Planning Analytics, Anaplan, and other BA tools that can assist you. When I have discussions around ESG reporting, I always discuss it around the need to basically look at where you're at in your ESG cycle, including your tooling. Um, I also emphasized earlier about the frequency of doing the carving and your overall ESG to the operation management, because I'm a believer then is the more you put this down and change the culture, the more you can change your net zero footprint and your overall ESG policies to drive better outcomes. Because consumers, banks, everybody want more insight in terms of your overall ESG footprint, and it's critical to drive this. Audit costs are likely going to go up. This is why it's critical to revisit your GRC um, solution, whether or not you need to purchase one or update that model based on the new requirements of these regulatory filings. And of course, you're going to be paying consultant fees, employment costs as part of related to your sustainability policies and metrics. Most large enterprises and even the mid-size probably already will, if not, are will probably have a sustainability department. Now, the key is with them that sustainability manager is working with the finance team. In most cases, sometimes they're just in isolation. They work as part of the overall GRC and compliance group and don't necessarily always integrate it, and they probably built their own models to do it. They may hire uh, somebody as a financial analyst to support them, but that's something to bear in mind. The other thing I always recommend too as well is basically doing a health check on this, and that's critical too as well. And you're selecting the right business partner that has the ESG knowledge and the model building is critical as well. And I've worked with a lot of good partners, and most of the partners they're starting to develop their own ESG practice to support ESG across geography and industry. Here's some tips and tricks. You should understand your industry. You should review your reporting and other models and see what can be done in terms of building a new cube or building a new reporting cube related to ESG reporting. Biodiversity is getting more focused, so you're going to want to work and create specific teams around this. And I think in general, ESG will have its own committee. Working with Excel add-ins, most organizations will have the OneStream or uh, data rail or any other solution add-in. Costing models become critical, just like you do with an activity-based model. You'll end up having to upgrade this. Supply chain becomes critical because now you're going to be working in overemphasizing the scope 3 emission, not overemphasize, emphasizing scope 3 emissions into it. That's cool. Tracking scope, that's where you're getting into the overall, each one, which is scope 1, 2, and 3 side. Partnering with the supply. Europe's put in more mandates around the traceability side, so you're going to want to do this. And basically, just in general, you're going to need to basically have proper training for HR. The key is it's all going to come back to policy and all come back to the data. What's next? This just gives you an idea where you need to develop strategy, need to stay up to date where the ESG standards are. Um, I have emphasized that the global standards need to bring, as I talked about, around emissions, biodiversity, water, facilities, HR, planning, corporate governance, and social governance need to have their own standards to ensure that we have consistency of reporting. So when you look at company A within the same industry, they're reporting similar. If you look at company A from one industry to finance or another sector, they're reporting in a similar template. Um, like anything else, you need to track your outcomes, you need to target it, and you need to have the board of directors all involved, and that strategy needs to be pushed down. And then you need to look at the way you do your capital calculations and your operational expense planning as well as part of the overall ESG. Here's some additional links you can see here. Um, Net zero, this is just a blog there. I'm an expert in consolidation reporting. ESG will fall into that. Compliance and risk, I'm an expert in that too as well. I've worked with solutions like Open Pages and all of that in my career. And I've done a lot of work on data strategy and data management. This presentation was to give you a quick overview to prepare you. Nothing stopping you from reaching out to me personally for any assistance on this. I do have deep contacts and partners. I can help you put you in contact with if you're looking for an ESG solution or just in general have a conversation where you're at and where you need to pivot. Thank you.